Olá, Belunsira, fila fale hamutu ko hau, iha canal YouTube idane. Ia video idane hause fahe baita botsira, reflexão ou comentário badak husi Padre Frank J. Moloney. Nia amlulik salesiano, australiano ida, e matenek na imbot, teólogo, e doutor, professor, e nia hakerek livro barak de teves, com a teologia. E niamos esperto iha Evangelho São João inia. Nia tenek lean di dia com a Evangelho São João inia. Amlulik ne hau hasuru nia vai hira nia vai timor iha tinan 2017, se aula sala. Nia ba prega retiro iha fui loro e a minha soro guan ba hau nos consegue participar nia retiro. Furak teres. Depois de tinan ida hau mai hela hamutu ko nia iha ne e vai hira COVID-19 afeta mundo toma hau husu nia hanoi. Saida mai nia sente. Será que ida ne castigo ida husi maroma kane sai no bara kanoi? Será que ida ne maldição ou bênção telah tene? Mas be mai tabarona hamutu be sai da minha sente usini minha ponto de vista. Hamutu ko Padre Frank J. Moloney, STB.
This terrible plague, we might call it, to use the words of the medieval period when they talked about these sorts of health inflictions that killed so many thousands of people over the centuries, is unique to our experience, and it's certainly a bad thing. Obviously, anything that kills thousands and thousands of people, and not only kills them but kills them with great suffering, people who are struggling to breathe and eventually can no longer survive, that's a very difficult way to die, and it creates great distress in their family to see them suffering in this way. So obviously the first thing to say about the coronavirus is that it's a terrible infliction, and we are really struggling as a human race to overcome it, and in some ways to make sense of it. And it's to that second point that I'd like to turn and say, well, obviously in itself it's very bad, but can we make some sense out of this suffering and death that's been inflicted on the whole world? It spared no one in the whole world. Well, I think the first thing we need to say is to recognise, and it's very important that we recognise, that these sorts of issues, as we know from the science, are the result of human activity. Very often religious people can immediately begin to think, oh, God is punishing. And this, of course, is a very bad understanding of God. The primary thing about evil in the world is that it comes from human beings who either consciously or non-consciously generate issues that then become enormous, like this COVID-19. So the first thing that we've got to say is that this evil thing is not the result of the action of God in some way generating suffering to make human people suffer. This is not the way God acts. But then there are very many other positive things that comes from our way, among all of the societies that it's touched, to respond to this evil. Not all of it, of course, has happened as it should happen. And there are evils involved in that. I'll give you an example. This should be something that unites the whole of society, of whatever nation or religious tradition or whatever racial background they come from. We should cut across all barriers to help one another to overcome this? Very often we haven't. Every political entity tends to look after itself, sometimes to the detriment of others. But there has been some very good sharing across the nations in this. And there'll be a big challenge now once a vaccine emerges, that this vaccine is made available to those most vulnerable, and that it doesn't just go to the wealthy and powerful people so they will be okay without worrying about others. That's a positive that could come out of this, but it might also be a negative in a world that is often determined by money and power. And I hope that that is not the case. One of the most obvious good consequences of COVID-19 is the fact that it has generated a great deal of creativity among people. Things that we have never thought of once doing, we now do. Whole systems of education have been developed so that students at all levels, from infant schools all the way through to universities and research programs, are now being conducted via electronic media. We've began to think about doing things differently. We've began to move sideways, and this has shown that human beings have a lot of agility to overcome problems by thinking what we call laterally. Think laterally. We can't do it that way. Can we do it some other way? And the human race of all nations and all classes has handled this very well and has maintained certain levels of communication which are essential to our well-being and to the education of the next generation. Another very good thing, of course, has been the development among people of care, starting with the medical people. At enormous risk and self-sacrifice, they have put themselves in the front line and have done everything they can to help their people to overcome this sickness, to see them through to health, and to look after with dignity those who are dying. This has been an enormous challenge, but I think, generally speaking, the medical people and the general health people have responded magnificently to this, and they need to be regarded as heroes in this particular situation. The final thing I'd say is, putting all of this together would be, I really hope that if and when we emerge from this plague, as I called it at the beginning, if and when we emerge, some of the hopes that I expressed earlier will become more real in our lives. The hope that we'll be a more unified people. The distinctions of colour and tradition and religion will be lessened as we see that we are all human beings, we all need one another, we all need care, and we are all following the same goal to be a better and healthier people and to look after those who aren't, seeing them dealt with dignity through to the end of their lives. So while we are dealing with an obvious evil thing in the world, this is not a God-given problem. It's a problem that comes from human beings, and the positive is that it has generated a situation where all the skills and the depths of humanity that we all have can work together to produce better outcomes, both for worldwide health and for the care of those who are sick and who are dying.